Welcome everyone to today's CSE Development in Action webinar on sustainable education reform in complex systems, reflections from a global perspective. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Evangeline Aritwala. I'm the Alumni Engagement Officer. And I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today, Bhagya Manjaree, Hewa Siliyange. Bhagya is a 2021 Commonwealth Split Site Scholar from Sri Lanka, and she is completing her PhD in Science Education at the University of Cambridge and the University of Colombo. She's a split site scholar, and she will be discussing her work and her research around this webinar topic, and providing a great insights on her work across the Commonwealth. Um, Bhagya Manjaree is a lecturer in science, and she leads as a global educator knowledge exchange pilot. She leads on a global educator knowledge exchange pilot initiative designed to support reciprocal capacity building across diverse education systems, which she will be highlighting today. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Bhagya, who will also provide further details on her work and her background. And again, just a reminder, if you have any questions for Bhagya, please do send them via the chat box, and we'll try our best to address these in the Q&A session. Bhagya, over to you.
Thank you, Evangeline. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure whether it's good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Anyways, thank you so much for being here. And I'm Bhagya Manjaree, as Eva mentioned. And it's actually a pleasure that you all joined the session. So as you all know and expecting that I'll be speaking about sustainable education reform in complex systems with a reflection from a global perspective. What I really want to explore is basically why reforms so often look clear and convincing at policy level, but becomes much more difficult and difficult to sort of translate and translate to practice once they reach institutions, classrooms, and basically the everyday practice. So across systems, education is being asked to do more, such as improving quality, widening inclusion, responding to labor market change, uh, engaging with AI nowadays, technology. So many expectations basically. So they often work while they are within quite tight constraints. So this talk is not only about reform itself, I would say, but about the conditions that make reform either sustainable or fragile in practice. So let me begin with a brief introduction to my own background for you to understand why this topic matters to me. Just to briefly situate myself in this conversation, I'm actually currently working across research, teaching, and wider professional engagement. As Eva mentioned, I'm a split site doctoral researcher to University of Cambridge from University of Colombo, and I'm co-funded both by Commonwealth Scholarship and Cambridge Trust Scholarship. So at the same time, I also work in full time at further education and higher education industry in the UK after completing 16 years of experience in education sector, both locally and internationally. So I think about reform not only as an academic issue, but also as something that affects real institutions, real staff, real learners. So the opportunities to engage with a number of international and professional spaces, when I consider that, like I'm also involved as an advisory panel member for Commonwealth Scholarship Commission, and then as a venture review panelist for Imperial College London, then as a mentor for Homerton College, Cambridge for their Changemakers program. And also I've contributed, and also planning to contribute for upcoming UNESCO IIP strategic debates about education policies and etc. So having said that, all the reflections that I'm going to present today are actually coming from all this experience and my contributions, and I'm trying to connect research, practice, and global dialogue in a more holistic and meaningful way. That's what I'm trying to do today. So to begin with, just to give an overview, I'd like to start by stepping back and looking at the wider reform movement that we are in, because we all are in a reform moment as nations. Across many education systems, reform is being driven by multiple pressures, to name it, like it could be AI, rapid technological accelerations, and then skill gaps between education and work, and expanding expectations of schools and colleges about what they're supposed to deliver, and etc. So education systems are expected to do more than just transmitting knowledge. That was what it was a few decades ago. But now they are actually expected to do more, but at the same time, as I said, they have these reduced funding, rising delivery pressures. So there are a lot of, let's say, limitations and challenges that they face. So the key point here is that reform is not happening in a simple, neutral environment in most of the places. Not to forget, even in developing countries, the case is the same, almost the same. So it is happening in a system where pressure from technology, labor market, society, they all are interacting at once. So that itself is a broader context for everything that we are going to discuss today. So moving on to our next slide, I think one of the most important ideas in this discussion is this reform implementation gap, because reform often begins with strong intentions at policy level, but the challenge is what happens as the reform moves through systems, because it has to pass from system vision to curriculum documents, teacher practice, and finally to student experience. So at each of these stages, reform can lose coherence, not necessarily because people do not care, but because classroom life is complex. Teachers work under real constraints. Institutions have existing routines, and systems are shaped by cultures, not to forget, which is a major factor. And then assessment strategies that we are so used to and integrated in. And then the infrastructure, resources, there are so many things which are actually connected to this complex life. So the key issue here is not the quality of reform idea itself, I would say. It is the quality of its translation into practice. So this gap is what we are going to focus today. So these reflections that I'm going to present today, as I said, will be informed quite strongly by my doctoral research. My work has focused mostly on context-sensitive pedagogical design in exam-oriented systems, particularly through design and implementation of an inquiry-based authentic science education framework. But what became clear through my work is that pedagogy does not operate in isolation. It is quite shaped by assessment pressures, cultural expectations, institutional routines, and wider system constraints. So even though I started my research as a classroom practice, it actually led me to think much more broadly using a systematic perspective, especially to understand how educational change could be shaped by the interaction of pedagogy, assessment, culture, and system conditions in an education reform event. So that was actually something that I was basically reflecting about. So that is the perspective that I'm bringing into this talk today. So the next question is why this discussion matters across different Commonwealth contexts. I want to be clear that I'm not going to say that all systems are the same. Obviously, they are not. But comparative research does suggest that there are some recurring structural patterns especially like between similar contexts, that shape reform implementation across many Commonwealth contexts. So these includes things like high stake examination cultures, uneven institutional and system capacities, socio and economic inequalities, then policy instabilities across governance cycles due to certain political aspects, and the tensions between global reform agendas, like globally, and then local pedagogical cultures, which are quite strongly integrated in, and so many. So while the details differ from one country to another, the broad implementation challenges are often recognizable, and that is why I say that challenges are comparable but context dependent. And that becomes very important because it means reform cannot simply be borrowed or imported. It has to be understood in relation to the conditions of the system in which it is being introduced. So moving on to the next slide, I think one very useful distinction is this, that reform can be treated either as an event or as a process. So, sorry, it's the choice of the nation or the country. But when it is treated as an event, the pattern is quite often I would say it's familiar, because there will be a policy announcement and a curriculum will be released. Perhaps one-off training sessions will be given, and then the implementation expected to happen. But often there is very little follow through in terms of feedback, refinement, or long-term support. So the system shows activity, but not always sustainability, I would say. But now, if we think of, on the other hand, if we think of reform as a process, the picture looks a little different, because it becomes more gradual, more phased, and more open to learning. And that means ongoing professional development will happen iteratively, regular feedback will be collected, iterative improvements rather than just one-time rollout will be there. So the core point here is that sustainable reform depends not just on introducing change, but on building the conditions for that change to evolve and to strengthen over time. In my opinion, that itself is sustainability. So the same thing I have presented here in a different perspective, because to highlight the two different ways of thinking about reform. So in an event model, the main stages are launching, training, distribution, and then expectation. So the focus is more, I would say, outward facing. The success is often judged by whether the reform was introduced visibly and efficiently. But in a process model, the stages are different. We design, we pilot it out, and then we reflect, we adjust, we scale it, and we monitor. So focus become more process centered, and the success is judged not only by launch itself, but by whether the system is learning and improving over time. So I think this matters because many reforms are quite strong at the event level, but much weaker later at the process level. So that is often where sustainability is lost. So this is again a very interesting slide, because one of the biggest threats to a sustainable reform is lack of continuity. I'm sure that most of us are aware of this. This diagram is just a simple illustration of how reform can begin and then be interrupted by political change and then effectively be reset before the system has really learned through it. So in many contexts, reform cycles align quite closely with these electoral cycles and shift in political leadership. So reform may begin under one government, but it is then we do not let it to mature. We do not let that time to mature it, and then the priorities change and the process is redirected and reset. So the problem here is not only interruption at policy level, it is also the loss of institutional learning, because reform needs time and it needs space for people to understand, test it, refine it, build confidence around it. So if that process is repeatedly interrupted, educators can experience reform as disruption, workload, rather than meaningful improvement. So actually, this not having this meaningful improvement and feeling like that itself, we call it as reform fatigue. So that is not a good thing to experience during a reform. So that is why continuity and stability are more important for sustainability. So one key question for sustainable reform is not only what change is introduced, but whether the system is stable enough to stay with that change long enough to learn from it, because we need time. That time factor is quite important, and the consistency. So this slide actually explains another major issue in many systems, the power of high-stake examinations or assessments. So examinations do not only measure the student performance, in such situations, they often shape classroom priorities very directly. So when exam results matter strongly for progression, reputation, ranking, then education becomes
I'm sorry, we may have lost Bhagya. We'll just wait for a few minutes for her to rejoin us. Apologies for this.
Hello.
Hi, Bhagya, you're back.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Was it
No
my
worries,
connection?
no
Yeah.
problem at all, no problem.
Let me share the screen.
Yeah, yeah, we are back.
Yeah. Shall I continue from where I
Yes,
stopped?
please. Yes, go
Okay.
ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so we were talking about this high-stake examinations. So examinations, as I said, like they do not only measure the student performance, they, examine a lot of other things like classroom priorities. So basically, in this context, when reforms are reinforced by these sort of like high-stake examinations, and reinforced by public comparison and performance pressures and private tutoring and such, even supplementary tutoring like shadow education and stuff. This creates equity tensions because competitive systems rarely affect all learners in the same way. So the broader message here is that assessment is not just one part of the system, it is often one of the strongest forces shaping how reform is interpreted and also enacted. So that's very important aspect for us to consider. Moving on to the next slide, again, another very interesting one about culture, the classroom culture. So many systems like consider effective teaching as something which is strongly associated with order, discipline, teacher authority, or maybe a structured classroom environment, as you see in the first picture here. So if there is pin drop silence in the class, we consider that to be like an effective classroom teaching. So when reform promotes something like, let's say, inquiry-based or discussion-based or collaborative learning, where the classroom gets little messier and little, noisy, then how are we going to perceive that? Like, so this sort of collaborative learning, they may be asking for a deeper cultural shift, I would say, rather than policy language sometimes recognizes. So this issue is not that one model is simply right, or the other one is wrong. The issue is that reform often, sorry, some are waiting. I'm getting a message. Yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
sorry, don't worry about that.
yeah. Okay.
We'll see you.
So when reforms promote these things like inquiry-based or discussion-based or collaborative learning, so this deep cultural shift definitely has to be considered. Um, Now, when we enter a classroom where expectations about teaching or about questioning, about participation or about authority are already quite well established, and they have their own way of judging what an effective classroom is. And if we are saying something totally opposite that is going to be effective, how are we going to translate it? That itself is going to create tension, especially reform assumes that student-centered approaches can be adopted very quickly without attending to those wider cultural norms in most of the cases. That's actually, I've seen that as one major reason where reforms fail, because it's not that easy, because teachers tend to do what they are already doing because they do not want to be judged in the wrong way. So sustainable reform needs to think not only about pedagogy, therefore, but also about the classroom cultures into which that pedagogy is being introduced. Um, so moving on to our next slide, this is about system capacity that I'm going to talk about here. Reform is not sustained by policy alone, because it depends on the infrastructure, it depends on the practice, it depends on like quality assurance, maybe instructional or institutional monitoring, student well-being, quite importantly, safeguarding systems, attendance monitoring, accountability mechanisms that we have, and even leadership capacities at different levels of the system. So we should not be considering these as secondary issues, because they are a very important part of what makes implementation possible. So reform may look very strong at a policy level, but if the surrounding structure is weak or fragmented, we can further talk about it later, it may never become stable in practice. So one of the key questions in reform context is, does the system actually have this infrastructure to support the change what it is asking for? And if it is not there, how are we going to sort of integrate it, inculcate it within that system? So moving on to this slide, this is about the socio-economic inequality, because reform does not enter as a policy level, like not exactly policy level, like let's say a level playing field where everything is like equal to everyone. So it enters systems where schools and households often have very different levels of resources, support, and opportunities. So this matters definitely. These differences shape what kinds of school experiences are possible, and ultimately what kinds of student outcomes emerge out of it. So basically, in competitive environments, this can be intensified even by visible performance, especially like considering shadow education and private tutoring systems and etc. So the question is not only whether the reform is well designed, it is also whether the different learners have fair chances to benefit from it. So also it raises questions about dignity, student dignity, which in most of the Commonwealth context we will hardly consider, pressure, then psychological impact, where comparison is constant, like we constantly compare because competition is the driving force for most of the students, and disadvantage is highly visible therefore. So sustainable reform has to take inequality seriously, and not as a side issue, but as one of the conditions shaping the success of the implementation itself. So this slide, like I would say, this diagram is it's just drawn by me, and this is how I see reform, the whole picture. So it's actually a matter of balancing this whole unstable different factors, and finding that balance. It's not easy and it's very tricky. So I think one of the most important stabilizing forces in this particular reform agendas is teacher capacity, because reforms may be shaped by policy, assessment, culture, inequality, and infrastructure, as we discussed, but it is ultimately enacted through teachers, because teachers interpret it, they make sense of it, they translate reform into their daily classroom practices. So that means capacity is much more than subject knowledge, and it includes adaptive expertise like professional judgment and ability to respond to changing environments and etc. So like this becomes very important, like when we consider new teachers, and not to forget even dual professionals in some contexts. Now, particularly in further education, it could be in technical education, it could be in vocational education, where people from the industry are coming to teaching profession, which we call as dual professionals. So who may still be building their confidence in their teaching practice, while also if they have to like navigate these reform pressures, how are they going to sort of succeed in it, and what sort of help that they will need. So when we talk about sustainable reform, we need to talk seriously about whether teachers are being supported, not just to comply, but to understand, to adapt, and to grow. So that is why teacher capacity is also not a side issue. It is one of the central conditions that the whole reform agenda is stabilized, and I would say sustainability is maintained. So when we talk about teacher capacity, we need to talk about what kind of support actually can be built in terms of this teacher building teacher capacity. So this is where we think that we can move from these one-off training sessions to professional learning ecosystems. In many systems, reform support still takes the form of like short-term workshops, or like a one-day training session or something like that. So they can introduce ideas, obviously, but they are usually not enough to sustain these things, not strong enough to sustain, I would say, the change over time, because sustainable reform needs something more ongoing, coaching, like related coaching led sort of peer support and communities of practices where space for reflective dialogue was quite encouraged, and formal informal support was also given while the formal training is provided, and strong leadership support. So all this will make a real shift from content transmission to collaborative learning and adaptation. So in other words, like I would say, teachers need more than what we expect that they need. We mostly think that they need instructions, but they expect more than that. They need that space for reflect, space to test, space to iteratively refine and learn from each other's practices. So do we have platforms for these in reform conditions is one main aspect. So that's where reform has to be expected as an iterative and leading to iterative professional learning supporting effort. So this is also about this workshop and continuous loop change sort of a thing that I'm trying to show. Like if we want sustainable change, it's quite important that we move towards from workshops to continuous loops, because usually continuous loop is a cyclic process. So it allows reflection, it allows effort like piloting, adjusting, improving. So like we definitely have to think more of having these process driven changes in a realistic manner than having these event based efforts. So moving on to this slide. this is like about the key principle of sustainable reform, in my opinion. Like the context, it is a very complex thing to talk about the context before, because reform borrowing across systems is quite common thing. Like we love to import reforms from elsewhere, assuming that those are best practices. So it's a very common thing, and of course, and there is a value in learning from what somebody else has done. I obviously agree with it. And we call it best practice adaptation. That's also no problem in it. But my concern is local conditions matter, resources, their local realities, school realities, classroom cultures, institutional expectations, societal expectations. So all these things matter. So in that imported reform, are we considering these things? So the real question is not only whether the reform model is strong as itself, but also whether it is a good fit between that model and the context into which we are trying to introduce it to. So that's where the sustainable adaptation happens. And rather than copying reforms, we need to be carefully adapting them intelligently. So the synergy is again, this is something like now we can start, like we can assume that reforms often begins with adoption, because like we just, as an initial take up, we love to take new ideas from somewhere. That's fine. So we adopt from somewhere, and then but that adoption itself is not enough, because as I said, it could be a best practice we are copying, but we should not stop there. That is the most important thing, because from change to become sustainable, it needs adaptation. Like we adopt it and then we adapt to it. So adaptation, the reform has to be like shaped into the reality, the local reality, and that's then it is implemented in, and it fits to the environment, and with time it gets contextually embedded first, and that contextual embedding will slowly integrate that into the systematic embedding. That's where I think it becomes a normal practice within the system, rather than just remaining as an external initiative in the reform efforts. So sustainability comes not only from one of these stages. We can start from adopting something, but then we have to go through this whole process, and we have to make sure that it's like a synergy. It just works together. So adaptation to implementation, embedding contextually and systematically. So all these things should have to be like, we have to ensure that, and then the surface level adoption is not going to ensure that systematic adoption, which will lead to sustainable reforms. So this is that I'm trying to bring this holistic framework that like I have created conceptually. So it includes all these policy continuity that we discussed, assessment, curriculum coherence, institutional capacity, cultural and pedagogical alignments, professional learning ecosystems, equity and student dignity. All these, when they work together and interact together, that's when the sustainable reforms occur. And my argument is that reform becomes fragile when these dimensions are disconnected, and it becomes more sustainable when they begin to reinforce each other, because this shape is reinforced by each of these categories. So that's why I discuss this. I would like to introduce this model as a holistic architecture, rather than just a single event or an intervention, because what matters is not only whether the change is introduced, but whether the wider system aligns strongly to sustain it. So discussing about the operationalizing of this holistic architecture, I would say that it is again an iterative learning cycle. So we can start piloting it, we can implement, we can reflect, we can adopt, we can scale it, and then it will sustain. So in these stages, you'll see that reflection creates the basis for adaptation, and adaptation makes scaling more creditable, and sustainability becomes more realistic when reform has already been tested and improved through practice. So around that cycle, we also need professional learning, context sensitivity, institutional support, assessment alignments, and etc. So the message here is that capacity-oriented reform is not a static one. It is sustained through repeated cycles of learning and adjustment. So with all what I have presented so far, I think it just comes to these few questions, like which structural pressures most shape reform in your context? Where does reform tend to lose coherence in practice in your context? Because that could differ from context to context. Maybe you are the expert who knows that rather than me answering that. So what forms of professional capacity are most important in your context? And then again, what could context sensitive reform stewardship actually look like in your system? So these questions, if we ask from ourselves, because context reforms are context dependent, then perhaps the most useful thing is not to rush towards an answer, but to ask more questions and to understand the problem much more better. Because as we all know, a problem understood well is half solved, isn't it? So I think that understanding the context better is quite important, and that's where comparative education research dialogues become quite genuinely helpful. Having said that. This is my current workplace CEO, Rachel Nicole, and I just wanted to bring a quote from her saying that creating space for collaborative dialogue and communities of practice is essential for meaningful and sustainable education change, because nowadays this having these conversations about like reciprocal learning, cross context reflective dialogue, this has become quite a trend, because everyone has understood that there is opportunity for reciprocal learning because of these social mobilities and stuff like that, and also the fact that reforms are happening in most of the places. So having spoken about these reforms as something complex, contextual, and dependent on learning, I want to sort of end it by thinking about how we can continue this conversation in such context. So small scale practitioner informed communities of practice where people work in different systems can reflect together about what reform would look like in their own context and build an emerging space for reciprocal learning could be something that we can think of. So for that, I have this QR code, which is leading you towards a small survey. It's not a survey as such. It's just that for me to get to know you all better and to understand your interest, because I would really be glad if we can continue this conversation and to collaborate with all of you in future, because I have a lot of initiatives aligned for Commonwealth context, both as an independent researcher and also as through my current workplace. We do have some global educator engagement programs and communities of practice programs aligned. So maybe if y'all are interested, maybe if you fill that form, it will give me a chance to again be in touch with you. So I warmly welcome you to sort of fill that form, and feel free to reach out to me with your ideas or preferences for collaboration. If this interests you, it's about comparative research and collaborative dialogue. So yeah, this is also about that, like small scale comparative dialogue spaces, and maybe comparative writing or knowledge exchange, and etc. So this is just my references. So if y'all want to like read more about it, I can share these with y'all. Yeah, that's it. And thank you very much for listening. And I'll be very happy to open the conversation now for questions. Yeah. Over to you, Eva.
Thank you so much, Bhagya. That was a great conversation and very insightful webinar presentation on your work and your research. And before we move forward to the Q&A session, thank you for sharing the QR code. That's a great way to connect with our CSE community. So highly encourage everyone to maybe Bhagya, if you want to go back to that slide and give them a few more minutes to scan the QR code.
I
Uh,
think it's the same here.
Oh,
It
okay.
looks
Oh, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
perfect,
yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
Please scan the QR code and connect with her. You also have her email address and her LinkedIn profile on the screen. Um, do send in your questions. We do have a few more minutes for the Q&A session. I will begin the Q&A session now, so please do send in your questions. And again, we do have the post-webinar networking session, so we may have some opportunity to not just network and connect, but also ask questions, not just with Bhagya, but also to everyone else in the audience. Um, I would like to begin with a few questions that we received in the registration form. So, thank you to everyone who sent in your questions in advance. We have chosen a few questions to look at to begin the Q&A session. But of course, please do send your questions in the chat box as well. Bhagya, if you're ready, I can ask the first question.
Yeah, of course, Siva. Thank you.
Perfect. Um, how can one make a global impact in the public educational space?
So I think like go when you say global impact in education, it doesn't always begin with begin at a global scale, because it often would start with local context specific work which is meaningful within a particular context, and then you probably share that and connect with other scholars, or maybe reflect about it, across like different contexts sort of. So for me, it's something that we can start off via connections, collaborations. So just connect with researchers from different context, practitioners from different context, learn from each other, because I do not believe that some one counterpart is superior than the other, because there is always space for reciprocal learning, and I haven't seen any system perfect, because every system has its own space for improvement. So one way I would say is that you can think of, as I said, structured collaboration, comparative dialogue, co-authored writing, maybe like collaborative small scale researchers, like probably something that you can do it via a short survey or something. So like nothing, like don't think about a bigger scale thingy, just join with this whole thing, and it'll be a starting point for you to sort of bloom as a global comparative education researcher. So I invite all of you to do that.
That's amazing. Baby steps is the way to go. Thank you,
Exactly.
Bhagya.
Yeah.
All right, the next question is, are current tech-driven education reforms in Commonwealth countries helping to decolonize curriculum and align skills with local economies? Or are they reproducing colonial era dependencies in dispensing knowledge? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's very important and sensitive question, I would say. Um, I think like technology driven reform can do both. And it depends on how it is designed and governed, because it can support decolonizing education if it helps systems to bring in local knowledge, local languages, local examples, local priorities into the curriculum. But it can also reproduce dependency, as the question itself says, like if the reform is driven by the assumption that solutions from more economically powerful or maybe like developed places, so historically dominant systems, are automatically superior than which can simply, if you simply copy it. So it's just that I would say there has been this long standing tendency to look at outward practices and think, okay, best practices, and they are to be valued. And when the models are transferred without adaptation to local culture, infrastructure, teacher capacity, and all these local realities, that it is going to work, which is it is not, right? So for me, the issue is not whether knowing whether it is coming from West or elsewhere. The issue is whether it is critically adapted, locally owned, and probably whether we have thought about the capacity building. And because sustainable reform always connects learners to global knowledge while also protecting their local identity, their local relevance, and their local agency. So this is where technology becomes empowering, I would say, rather than dependent. So it's how you choose it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Moving to the next question, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat box. What mechanisms can ensure accountability in education reform, especially in systems where governance structures are weak?
Accountability is often thought as, let's say, monitoring, inspection, or checking whether people have complied. But like in a reform, accountability has to be much more, I would say, developmental, because it should help the system to learn. For an example, if let's say a new curriculum asks teachers to use inquiry-based learning, accountability should not only to ask, did the teacher follow the policy, but also should ask, like, what support did the teacher receive in terms of doing that? Like, were the assignments aligned, or did the school have resources, or what barriers emerged? Were the parents against that way of teaching? There are a lot of questions that we can ask without just asking, did you follow it? Sort of. So accountability, therefore, has to have a much more broader definition at policy levels, to make the reform goals more realistic, in that sense, I would say. So, like as you said, like weak governance context, maybe small feedback loops can be quite powerful. For example, like school level reflection meetings, teacher networks, that sort of simple attendance or process reviews, which is done by the principal, like led by the principal, or like a small group of teachers. So those could be counted as accountability.
Thank you. I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come in the chat box now. Um, how can you reconcile the fact that messy classrooms shape the behaviors in the classroom against the need for developing changed classroom norms?
Uh, as I said, now like messy classrooms, it's again like what aim that we have in terms of that particular lesson. Maybe the lesson, if the lesson is about inquiry based or project based or problem based learning, obviously the classroom will be messy if you want the learning to happen. But having said that, we also have to know that what sort of a environment that this classroom is operating. Is it operating in a system where they have to sit for an exam at the end, or whether there is like, let's say, whether there is a teacher observation which is happening at the same time, where the teacher is judged for pin drop silence, quiet, teacher-led classroom. So it's again a systematic perspective, very difficult to give one of answers, isn't it? Yeah, I would say we can look at that in a more systematic perspective and see that there are many more factors which are affecting that.
Great. Moving to the next question, and I mean, if you want to read the questions, you can access the chat box as well. Um, but moving to the next question, it's from an attendee who is a healthcare provider, and their question is, in adapting reforms, how can locally adapted service model work without compromising international or professional standards?
Can you repeat the question again? How can?
Yeah, while you're adapting reforms,
Yeah.
how can locally adapted service model work without compromising international or professional standards, that have been set maybe by international boards or international standards, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so then again, as I said, the best practices, like obviously there will be best practices, there will be standards, SOPs, like standard operating procedures that we have to adhere to, and there will be standard international quality aspects. So obviously we'll have to, because we all are now a globalized, connected world, and we are obliged to adhere to the global standards, international standards. But having said that, like how are we going to reach it? What are our milestones? What are our KPIs? Are they realistic? So like if you sort of break down the process of reaching to that and then look at the realities, and see what sort of small changes that you need to do. Maybe reaching to that international standard might not happen overnight, but if you try to make it happen overnight, then it will be a system failure. So maybe you need to take time and you need to do the small changes, and then you need to get feedback. You need to again iteratively improve your process. So I think again a systematic approach has to take place with proper understanding of the context, because if we don't understand the context, obviously you will be a part of that cycle of failure, I would say. Like that's something that I'm like planning to discuss at the end as a final message
Yeah.
about that cycle of failure. Yeah.
Great. Um, we've spoken a lot about reform and reform sustainability. In your experience, or in your career, your research, are there any real-time example of reform implementation in developing countries based on the context that you provided in your presentation?
Yes, of course. This is actually a very good time for me to talk about reform, because in Sri Lanka we are actually undergoing a reform at the
Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
and this is not a political talk or any biased presentation that I'm doing here. I wanted my country to sort of reflect, the authorities to reflect about what they are doing, because it's actually a much needed initiative, and we see things happening, and also I have doubts whether certain things are in place or not. Maybe I don't have access to those, or maybe I do not know also. But I'm planning to sort of share this with the ministerial contacts in Sri Lanka, so that they can reflect about what these points are, and sort of fill the gaps if there are gaps. And if there are no gaps, obviously I'm very happy for them. Yeah, there is a very strong reform, a full overhaul of the system which is happening in Sri Lanka at the moment.
That's a great example. Thank you. Um, How can educational reforms build and retain sustainability, especially in changing political context and the current reduction in financial aid for education? Of course, there's another question on, current funding cutoffs on the education system, which I will raise later on. But in your opinion, how can educational reforms build and retain sustainability with changing political context and the reduction in financial aid for education?
Um, So I think this political influence in education is actually quite vital, and something that we need to quickly get rid of, I would say, in most of the context. Because like if we have a national policy for every country for education, comparing, probably led by a committee, or people those who are qualified to do that, looking at the current needs of the fast moving world, like could be technological needs, or could be the work, education, and let's say education outcomes and workforce demand gap analysis. These things can actually talk about reforms and what sort of reforms that particular country needs, because country to country the reforms would vary. For an example, like if my country is a country which is having a agricultural, mainly based, our country's income is based on agriculture. The reform that my country needs might not be another country which is mostly based on, let's say, garments or any other production might need. So I would say, like, national policy is very important. So that national interest is very important, but that shouldn't be sort of driven by political benefits or outcomes or interest. So I'm not sure about the political side of it, but I was thinking maybe like if we can have a national committee for it and have a national policy where even if a government change, the policy continues because it is in the interest of the nation at that particular time. So only if the time changes and the stakeholders' demand changes, that's when the reform has to change or take a different route. Other than that, I think the reform has to happen as it was planned and then improve it continuously.
A lot of positive reactions coming through for your responses and also your presentation. Um,
Yeah.
Maybe one or two more questions. But of course, we can take more questions in the networking session as well. Talking about funding and funding cuts, especially for refugee settlements and vulnerable groups, especially in schools that relied on partner support. Many schools have been affected by these funding cuts, with the large number of teachers leaving due to the lack of funding for salaries or incentives and even school operations. Although there are partners who are trying to fill the gaps, but the need remains for high and require urgent coordinated action. What can be done to improve service delivery in these situations?
Mhm. I would say the first question that we should ask when we think about funding is it like, is it applicable only to this context, or is it something which the whole world is affected with? So like after coming to the UK and then seeing how things are happening here, my perspective, my perception actually changed because I see how vulnerable situation, like the institutions and the funding, and how tight these constraints and limitations are. And I would say more or less every context around the world is actually running with these volatile, environments, and then funding cuts, because as you see, the world priorities are changing, and then obviously now everyone is concerned about their securities, national securities, and then probably they might not look at education as a urgent need at the moment if their security is at a threat, for an example, I would say. So maybe it's again like priorities for that particular era. If you think of that particular time, if you think of, it's common around the world, everyone is facing this challenge, and it's here in the UK also. It's the same, and it's the same there in Sri Lanka as well. And I hope that it'll be the same in other contexts as well. So I would say what we can do is how are we going to improvise it? How are we going to sort of go around it and find our solutions? Because education is a change agent. The effect which it can actually give to the society is actually much more destructive if we don't handle it properly. I would say it's much more stronger than we talk about these wars and all this stuff, because we are talking about shaping generations and we are talking about our future. So education therefore is a huge change agent, and then how are we going to improvise it with what we have and within our constraints? Again, the facing the local realities, again, using the local. Now for an example, let's say we are talking about digital resources and stuff. Maybe we don't even have high-end AI and high-end internet and all that, but if you have radio, if you have probably one computer just already saved documents or something, that itself could sort of achieve something towards that agenda. So without just saying we don't have funds, we don't have resources, what do you have, how are we going to use it? You start from there, then rest of the things will slowly come into place. Maybe not in the way that you expected, but you can start it. And that start might probably be enough for you to attract more funding, I would say. That initiative is something which has to happen within us as educators. Yeah, in a
Yeah.
positive manner. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are a little over time, but maybe just one more question.
Yeah.
We spoke about socioeconomic inequality, which the attendee says is often underrated when looking at reforms. Could you be more elaborate on its contribution towards reforms?
Yeah, I mean, social inequalities definitely are underrated in most of the reforms. Probably they think that because, for an example, like again, the same examples we can think of, it could be like um, resources, it could be about priorities. Now for an example, let's say if there is a family who are like who are facing about, let's say, like the basic necessities for that particular family is an issue, and that if we expect that family to send the child to, sort of to these schools and then get this education which is like a new, all that is actually not practical in that context. So maybe how are we going to win that family? How are we going to convince the parents to send the kid to school instead of using the kid to do some work or to sort of earn a living at that point? So probably we can think of incentives again, maybe like family incentives. We can think of meals provided at schools. So because of the meal and because they are getting rid of that burden of providing that meal to the kid, the parent might be pushed to send the child, but the outcome will be much more better. So likewise we and also that is something, Eva, I would say again context dependent. Now some context might consider these as, now how is it happening? Are we like giving properly like a regulated meal? Is it something that is like is the quality monitored, or is it just that money allocated and money doesn't really go to the end end party? Because that depends on the context and what sort of a process that we have towards, till that thing goes to the end customer or the end user. So I think we'll have to rethink about our processes, especially like because a lot of funding moves around this context, but actually is the outcome good enough?
Hmm.
Maybe funding goes somewhere, and do we really monitor funding? Because I still remember in one of our Commonwealth context, some scholars, I'm not actually mentioning from which region or which country, they are actually questioning the Commonwealth about like they're happy that the Commonwealth gives a lot of support, but the question was, are you monitoring it? Because
Hmm.
are our like communities getting it? Because maybe there are third parties, maybe let's say the process is not monitored, sort of. So these monitoring processes again will give a redefinition for these inequalities, and how are we going to address that?
Hmm. Great. Um, well, thank you so much for responding to all our questions. With that, we come to the end of our Q&A session. And just to remind the audience, we have a post-webinar networking session soon after, which will not be a recorded session. But if you would like to get in touch with Bhagya, please do get in touch via her email or her LinkedIn, and also scan the QR code for further details. Bhagya, any final thoughts before we stop the webinar?
Yeah, as a final thought, I was thinking like sustainable reform actually begins with this deep contextual understanding that we discussed. So, when solutions are applied with only partial understanding of the context, they can change the very conditions um, that were meant to be improved. Because now we only understand part of the question and we are designing solutions, so that our solution itself has changed the context again. So that changing could create new problems which we are not aware. So therefore, uh, that's actually finally turning our good intentions into repeated cycles of failure. So that is why reform must be approached gradually, systematically, and not as an isolated solution, but as something which is aligned in context-sensitive systems.
That's a really good thought there. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and responding to all the queries that we received, Bhagya. And thank you to everyone for joining the webinar. Please do stay back online for the post-webinar networking session, which we will start very soon. Bhagya, if you can please go to the next slide.
Yeah.